Okay, we're broadcasting.
Perfect.
So it is recording now as well.
Okay.
Automatically records.
Wonderful.
Pause it though. Recording.
Perfect. Are we ready? All right. So hello, everyone. A couple people might join us, but that is wonderful. My name is Kelly Sullivan, and I'm a Master Gardener trainee through the Central Gorge Master Gardener Association. Thank you for joining us for this webinar on organic gardening. This is the second of 6 Gardening to Save the World webinars, where we'll have Oregon State University professors sharing with us topics that relate to how home gardening can aid in saving our environment. As you're starting your gardens this spring, we also wanted to share with you that the Central Gorge Master Gardener plant clinics are still available to you virtually. Plant clinics are free opportunities for home gardeners to ask their questions and get research-based responses from our trained Master Gardener volunteers. These questions can be anything home gardener related. Don't be afraid to ask. Have you ever had odd holes in your plants or had the leaves turn a weird color? The Master Gardeners can help you identify those problems so that you can find the next steps to help your plants. You can find the question submission form on one of these 2 websites. The second website here is where you registered for this webinar, or you can leave us a phone message. You can also expect to receive a reply with a diagnosis and suggestions within about 1 to 2 weeks, depending on the volume of client questions that we have. Registration also opened today for the Oregon State University Extension Land Steward course. This course is designed for small to medium acreage landowners to deepen knowledge and understanding of their property. This research-based, professionally developed course will cover topics from forests to farms, soils, water capture and delivery systems, riparian ecosystems, pasture management, fire preparedness, and economics. Next week, we'll also, on Wednesday, May 27th, the Central Gorge Master Naturalists are hosting this free and informative webinar, Climate Change Impact in the Columbia Gorge, presented by Bill Weiler, a wildlife biologist for the Sandy River Watershed Council, founder of the Columbia Gorge Ecology Institute, that's now called Gorge Ecology Outdoors, and author of several books, including Earth Speaks and Don't Run from Bears. Bill is also a member of the Columbia Gorge Climate Action Network Steering Committee, and he's pleased to share this presentation and engage your questions regarding the impacts of climate change and ways to build ecosystem resiliency in the gorge. So, tonight, what you all are here for, Erica Cherno will be teaching us about organic gardening. Erica is the new commercial and community horticulture specialist for Oregon State University Extension Services in Lane County. Erica has worked professionally in extension, project management, regulatory, and research-related positions for over 15 years. She previously held a joint position between Chemeketa Community College in Salem, where she taught horticulture classes, and OSU, where she assisted with organic strawberry and olive trials at the North Willamette Research and Extension Center in Aurora. Prior to that, she was an integrated crop management advisor with CABI, an international organization that delivers science-based knowledge to developing countries. Before completing her Master of Science degree from UC Davis in 2009, she worked in the organic industry in California. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please use the Q&A box to post them, not the chat box. So I'll give you a minute to see down below where the Q&A box is. We will be going through the Q&A questions, and we'll try to answer some of the questions throughout if we can. And if we want to answer them at the end of the presentation, I'll put them aside to leave a little space for Erica at the end, and I'll ask her some of those questions. Any follow-up questions that we don't address will be sent to you via email, the responses. Now we'll take a moment to transition to Erica to begin the presentation.
Okay, I'm actually going to turn my camera off if y'all don't mind. I find it a little distracting to see my talking head. So let's get going. So I'm going to talk about organic gardening and what it means and essentially what organic means. That's kind of what we're going to cover here tonight. I know there's a lot of kind of misconception out there about what organic is and what it means, particularly amongst consumers as well. So we'll kind of go through that tonight. Whatever reason, my computer is always really slow changing slides when I do webinars. So hold on here. Okay, here we go. I'll use this. So to me, this is kind of my personal definition of organic gardening and what I think it means. I'll give you the legal definition of it in a little bit. But basically, I think it's kind of a holistic approach to agriculture that looks at a farm as an ecosystem and not just a unit of production that's there to kind of pump out yields, but really looking at the whole ecology of the farm, the soils, the crop, the climate, the insects, everything in and around it, and how they all relate within that ecosystem. There's a strong emphasis on building healthy soil in organic, building up the organic matter, maintaining the health of the soil, the biological activity of that soil, and reducing erosion as well. Organic also seeks to minimize the use of toxic chemicals. It doesn't mean that you don't use any pesticides or any chemicals. It's just there's a select number of chemicals that are permitted for use in organics, and this is really about generally trying to select the least toxic ones available and using other methods of controlling pests. Organic also helps to promote biodiversity. That's a big emphasis of organics, moving away from these monocropped type agricultural systems to ones that are more diverse on farm. So I'm just going to kind of talk a little bit about the history and how we got to this point. So, going back centuries, people have been using some natural-based materials as pesticides. There's documents of this in Roman times, going back even further than that. But things like sulfur and use of ladybugs and natural enemies or natural-based soaps and oils, these have been used for a really long period of time. But obviously people were limited in the number of tools that they had available to them. Moving into the World War II era, so into the last century, there were a lot of different chemicals that were produced during that time. Organophosphates were produced. They were used as nerve agents during the war. DDT was used to control things like typhus and malaria during that time. There was also a lot of ammonium nitrate that was also produced at that point in time that was used for making bombs. And out of a lot of the research that happened, things with organophosphates, it's a nerve agent. They realized, well, not only is it a nerve agent on humans, but it works really well against, insects as well. Ammonium nitrate not only can make bombs, but you can actually use it as a nitrogen fertilizer as well. So out of World War II, there was kind of this stockpile of chemicals that existed that were then essentially kind of diverted into our agricultural systems. Shortly after World War II, the Green Revolution was launched in the 1950s, and that was really looking at these high-yielding varieties and really kind of solving the issues of hunger around the world. We had a growing population at that point in time, and there was a lot of questions about how we were going to feed that growing population. So we did rely a bit on some of these new chemical agents for pest control, as well as some of these more synthetic agents for fertilizers as well. And so that Green Revolution, it kind of went around the world. It was promoted in other countries, here in the US as well. There was a lot of good that came out of it. You know, obviously we did feed that growing population of people, which is important, but there was also kind of a reliance that was developed on chemicals in order to solve pest control issues, or even just to fertilize crops as well. In the 1960s, Rachel Carson published Silent Spring. That was a groundbreaking novel. She discussed the impact of DDT and its negative effect on the environments and on, in particular, certain bird species as well. And that book really kind of inspired a whole generation of people and led to the environmental movement of the 60s and 70s that kind of took place. So she's a really important person to consider and remember in our history. Moving into the 70s, we did, the US established the Environmental Protection Agency. So that was a really important move that was established in 1972. And also during this time, there was kind of a return to the land type movement that was taking place. A lot of, you know, the hippies of the 60s or whatnot were moving back to the land. Starting to grow their own food. You started to see these farm co-ops that started to kind of spring up during this time. And there was just kind of this grassroots growth that occurred during that time period of people returning to the land, trying to kind of produce food naturally, forming co-ops, etc. And back in the early 70s was when the first organic certifiers were actually formed here in the US. So you had CCOF, California Certified Organic Farmers, that was formed down in California, and Oregon Tilth, that was also formed at that time here in Oregon. And both of those organizations still exist and operate as organic certifiers to this day. They all had their own regulation. There was really no standard regulation. So Oregon Tilth kind of made up their own rules. CCOF made up their own rules. There were some certifiers over in the East Coast that kind of made up their own rules. And there was really no agreed upon definition of what is organic, what does it mean, and what types of rules and regulations should farmers follow. But that grassroots movement continued to grow throughout the 70s and 80s. And finally in the 1990s, the Organic Food Production Act of 1990 was passed. And this really gave the federal government, the USDA in particular, the impetus to form what was referred to as the NOSB, or the National Organic Standards Board. And that board basically became kind of this body that then it was made up of farmers and other people that worked within the organic industry. And they were the ones who sat down at a table together and came up with what would eventually be the National Organic Program Standards. So one federal rule that would kind of define what organic means for the entire United States. So instead of having each state with their own certifier having their own rules, there would now be one agreed upon standard and rule. They passed their first draft of the National Organic Program Standards in 1997. There was a huge public outcry to that draft. They allowed GMOs, sewage sludge, irradiation, all these things, phone calls poured into the Capitol at this time. And basically due to all that public outcry, they had to go back to the drafting board and the drafting table and work once again on those standards. And so I think they went through like one more draft, and then finally in 2001, the final rule was agreed upon, and it was actually implemented in 2003. So as of 2003, we have the National Organic Program Standards. It's the agreed upon federal regulation that governs what organic is, what it means here in the US. And so you can see that little USDA organic logo down in the corner there. You often see that in grocery stores. Go walk around your grocery store, once that's safe to do again, and check out the labels on packaged foods and containers, and you'll often see that there. And that basically means that that product or the farm that it came from was essentially certified organic to these standards. And this standard also applies to anyone who wants to import into the US. So anyone who's growing food in Europe or Mexico or wherever they may be, if they want to sell their product as organic here in the United States, they have to be certified to these standards. So these standards gave us the legal definition of what organic means. And I'll just kind of read through this real quick, but it's basically an ecological production management system that promotes and enhances biodiversity, biological cycles, and soil biological activity. It's based on minimal use of off-farm inputs and on management practices that restore, maintain, and enhance ecological harmony. And it responds to site-specific conditions by integrating cultural, biological, and mechanical practices that foster cycling of resources, promote ecological balance, and conserve biodiversity. So that's a lot of jargon, but basically what it means, you know, there are certain fertilizers that are allowed, not allowed. For pest management, we'll go through this a little bit more, but you can't just rely on chemicals. You have to be using these integrated pest management approaches, the cultural and biological and mechanical practices. You have to use organic seed unless it's not commercially available. So if you can't find a specific variety that you want, or it's not sold in the quantity that you want, then they can resort to using a non-organic seed. Things like crop rotations, farmers have to show that they're using and implementing crop rotations, and that they're using things like cover crops or compost or other organic materials to help build and maintain the health of their soil. So we'll kind of focus on what organic inputs are allowed this evening. Just this is the area that there's typically a lot of misconceptions and misunderstanding around, and people typically have the most questions about this. But basically, under the National Organic Program, anything that's non-synthetic, so naturally occurring, is considered to be allowed unless specifically prohibited under Section 205.602 of the law. So, you know, lead's natural, arsenic's natural, you know, rotenone, it comes from the Daris root, so it's a botanical. These are all non-synthetic or naturally occurring things that could be used as pesticides, but they are very toxic. And so therefore they are specifically listed as prohibited under the NOP rule. Likewise, anything that's synthetic or you know, is considered prohibited unless it's specifically listed as either allowed or restricted under Section 205.601. So it could be just allowed outright where people can use them. Oftentimes there's restrictions that go along with these. So for example, there's some micronutrients that are synthetic that farmers are allowed to use, but they have to have a soil test or even a leaf tissue test that documents that there's an actual deficiency in that micronutrient before they can go out and apply, you know, some type of micronutrient. So they have to show they have a boron deficiency or whatever it may be. Mulches are listed in this. So that's like plastic mulch that people often use. You see that a lot in strawberry production, especially down in California. So that is also restricted. You know, you can use them, but you have to remove them before they start to break down in the soil. Copper, you know, that's used quite often as a fungicide. Once again, you can use it, but you also have to be taking soil tests to show that you aren't accumulating heavy levels of copper in the soil. So there are some synthetics that are allowed, but they typically come with a few caveats attached to them for people to be able to use them. Okay, in terms of fertilizers, we'll talk a bit here. So fertilizers also fall under the synthetic, non-synthetic. So most organic fertilizers are naturally occurring. They're from plant or animal-based materials or some type of rock or mineral or even seaweed-based products. The key thing to keep in mind is that, you know, the concentrations of the nutrients that are in those materials or fertilizers will really vary. You know, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, those are your three macronutrients that are really the most important. Most commercial-based fertilizers are going to contain one or even all three of those. And the thing to keep in mind with nitrogen, I don't have a lot of time to go into the nitrogen cycle this evening, but just keep in mind that when you apply organic nitrogen, well, first let's start with nitrogen's available or exists in many forms in our environment. So if you apply an organic fertilizer, the nitrogen in there is going to be an organic nitrogen. Plants can only take up two types of nitrogen, or there's two types that are really available for them. That's ammonium and nitrate. So that organic nitrogen is not actually available for the plants to take up. It first has to go through that nitrogen cycle where it gets mineralized by all these biological organisms that live in the soil, gets mineralized into ammonium, and then it can either be taken up as ammonium or it gets goes through nitrification and gets converted into nitrate, where it can then be taken up by a plant. And that's kind of important to remember because when, you know, if you're applying say a synthetic, a nitrate fertilizer, or even a urea-based fertilizer, those are immediately available for plants to take up. With organic fertilizers, they do have to go through that mineralization before they're available. So they're considered slow release. That process of mineralization, it can vary depending on things like temperature and moisture in the soil, things that are going to impact all those biological organisms and their activity in the soil. So a lot of organic fertilizers, they aren't maybe immediately available. They tend to be released slowly over the course of the year. So that can really be a challenge for farmers because maybe the nutrients aren't there when it's immediately needed by the plants itself. So there's a lot of research going into this, into the timing of application of our organic fertilizers and trying to understand a bit more about that mineralization process. About 50% gets mineralized during that first year, and then a lot of it actually just gets stored you know, in the soil where it's then, you know, continues to be mineralized in subsequent years as well. When you're going out and buying fertilizers, typically you'll have a bag that's going to have 3 numbers on those. Those 3 numbers are basically the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that are in that fertilizer. So 3, 15, 0, that's about 3% nitrogen, 15 phosphorus, and then it doesn't actually have any potassium in it. So always pay attention to those labels on the bag. They also tell what the product was derived from. Obviously, bone meal is pretty self-explanatory, but often if you read the ingredient statement, there may be a little other information that's actually quite interesting down there. And then I'll also just point out that this fertilizer label does have this little OMRI logo. So that's the Organic Material Review Institute. They actually review materials that, you know, if you're a chemical company or you make, you know, this is Down to Earth, they're here in Eugene, they make a bunch of different organic fertilizers. They want to market their fertilizers to organic. They have to go through a certain approval process to get them approved for use in organics. When applying fertilizers, it's really important to remember that different crops have different needs. So there are some crops that are heavy feeders. They take up a lot of nitrogen in a given season, things like broccoli and cauliflower. Those are all considered, you know, heavy feeders. And then there's others that, you know, don't take quite as much. You know, beans and cucumbers and squash tend to be light feeders. So it is important not to just fertilize for the sake of fertilizing. It's important to know what your crop needs and also what's already available in the soil itself. So with organic fertilizers, there are some pros and cons to them. Some of the pros are that they do contain carbon. So that carbon breaks down. First, it's food for all those microorganisms, right? They need carbon. They also need nitrogen. So, you know, when you think about making compost piles, they talk about the browns and the greens. That's basically your carbon and your nitrogen. And, you know, the organisms need them. It gives them energy. They use it for building their cell walls and their bodies and everything like that. So it's essentially food for the organisms that live in the soil. So you're essentially feeding that soil food web when you do apply a lot of these organic fertilizers because of that carbon content in there. But carbon also will break down and eventually become organic matter and humus, and that really helps improve the nutrient holding and water holding capacity in the soil. Also, a lot of organic fertilizers, because they aren't available in that nitrate form, they tend to be less prone. Nitrate's very mobile. It moves very easily through the soil, so it can be lost and leached easily from the soil. A lot of organic fertilizers, because they're in that organic nitrogen form, they tend to be less prone to leaching. Some of the cons or challenges of using organic fertilizers is, again, they do tend to be slow release. So the nitrogen may not be mineralized and available at the point that the crop really needs it in its life cycle. So it can be challenging for farmers to kind of time their fertilizer applications to kind of correspond when the plants will need it most. And you don't always know how much nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium's in them. This is particularly true of things like composts or manures. There are some composts that will, you know, facilities that will give you like a guaranteed analysis of what's in their compost. But beyond that, you don't always know how much NP or K you're actually applying. I break organic fertilizers down into 3 categories. There's your organic or your compost and your animal manures. You can use cover crops and green manures, as well as a lot of commercial fertilizers as well. So with animal manures, you know, the amount of NP or K that you're getting in them will really vary. Chicken manure tends to be the highest in all three of those. So if you're looking for a good source of NPK, chicken manure is great. You know, sheep and rabbit manure are also pretty high in all of those, but it's really going to vary. The amount of nutrients that you find in any given manure is going to vary depending on the diet of those animals, their bedding, moisture, how long it was aged, etc. So, you know, always take these types of analyses with a grain of salt. The other thing I want to say about animal manures is it is something that is restricted under the organic program. So with manures, due to food safety concerns, basically they have to be applied either 90 days prior to harvest for a crop whose edible portion does not come into contact with the soil. So something like a broccoli or a cauliflower, you know, you can apply a manure 90 days prior to harvest. For crops whose edible portion comes into contact with soil, like a carrot or, you know, beets or radishes, things like that, then it needs to be applied 120 days prior to harvest. So that's essentially gives it enough time to be broken down by the microbes, and any risks of any, you know, food contamination is minimized at that point in time. Compost can always also be used. There's a lot of rules around how compost is made in terms of how many times you have to turn the pile. You have to monitor, you know, if you're making on-farm compost, a lot of growers have to monitor the temperature, make sure it reaches, you know, at least, I think it's like 150 degrees for a certain number of days as well. So it is, you know, there's a lot of documentation that goes into this if farmers are making on-farm compost in order for them to show that their compost actually meets the regulations of the USDA National Organic Program. But compost also, what you find in a compost pile, if you were to take a scoop of compost, send it off to a laboratory and analyze it for the amount of NPK, it will vary greatly as well, depending once again on what actually goes into that compost, you know, how long it took to decompose, age, etc. Oftentimes, if you buy from a commercial compost facility, they will kind of give you a guaranteed analysis. They don't take that analysis from every single batch. They kind of have a sampling kind of program that they use where maybe, you know, every so often they go out and sample certain piles and take an analysis of that and then kind of take the average of those. So again, it can really vary. You know, anything with chicken litter in it, it's going to be higher in NPK than something with, say, beef manure or even just your basic kitchen scraps as well. It's going to have a much lower concentration of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium than something that has, say, chicken litter in it. Cover crops are also encouraged and kind of almost required under the National Organic Program. You have to show that you're maintaining your soil health, that you're reducing erosion, that you're doing what you can to kind of build up the organic matter content of that soil. And one great way to do that is through cover crops. So in particular, you know, nitrogen fixing cover crops, they have the ability to take atmospheric nitrogen, and with the symbiotic relationship that they have with rhizobium bacteria in the soil, they can convert that atmospheric nitrogen into a plant available form. So these nitrogen fixing cover crops, these legumes, can actually be used both for soil conservation purposes, but also as a nitrogen fertilizer as well. There's a lot of grass cover crops. They add a lot of organic matter to the soil. And cover crops also in general just kind of help reduce soil erosion, nitrate leaching. They can also help with pest pressure as well. Obviously, if you have a cover crop planted, they can help suppress weeds. They also provide habitat for beneficial organisms and insects as well. There's a lot of different types of cover crops. Legumes tend to be the common one that are used. So these are your nitrogen fixing cover crops. Anything that's, you know, vetch, clover, peas, and beans are your legumes. So they're the ones who will fix nitrogen into the soil. Grasses also make great cover crops. They have these really fibrous root systems that can scavenge quite a few different nutrients out of the soil. They also create a lot of biomass, and that biomass, you know, once you turn that cover crop back into the soil, that biomass breaks down and gets converted into organic matter. So they're a great way to kind of build up the organic matter of the soil. They also tend to be dense. So they're great for weed suppression as well. And then, you know, recently a lot of people are starting to use brassicas as cover crops as well. So your mustards, canola, you know, things like that. And they actually have the ability to act as a biofumigant. They have a chemical in them, it's called isothiocyanides. And basically when they break down in the soil, they release those into the soil, and they can, those isothiocyanides can actually help kind of control certain soil-borne pathogens and pests. So this is something where there's a lot of research being done on it. Brassicas are also great for building up organic matter, and there's even some certain types of radishes that have really deep root systems that can kind of help break up a compacted soil. I should throw out that brassicas aren't always recommended here in Western Oregon, particularly in the Willamette Valley. I don't know up in Hood River, but certainly in the Willamette Valley, brassicas are really susceptible to clubroot, and so it's a disease, and any brassica is essentially a host to it. So farmers are kind of encouraged not to use it as a cover crop down there, just because you don't want to basically be planting a host crop for this pathogen. The amount of nitrogen you get out of a cover crop will vary. You know, if looking at this table, if you're growing, let's say, red clover, if you have a stand that's less than 6 inches tall, you may get about 40 pounds of nitrogen per acre. But if it's a really healthy stand, it's greater than 6 inches tall, you can get anywhere from 50 to 80 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And that's quite substantial. You know, strawberries need like 120 pounds of nitrogen per acre. A lot of your fruit trees need about 110 pounds. So you're getting quite a substantial amount of nitrogen from these cover crops. Anywhere from 50 to 80% of the crop's nitrogen requirement may in fact come from cover crops. I'll also note that OSU's developed a cover crop calculator, and you can actually kind of take a sample of your cover crop. You have to take a certain number of samples throughout the field and mix them up, put them in a bag, send them off to a laboratory at Oregon State and Corvallis, and they'll analyze that and let you know how much nitrogen was actually in that cover crop. So you can actually calculate how much nitrogen you're getting out of that, and that will allow farmers to actually reduce the amount of fertilizer that they then need to apply. And then in the past 20 years, the thing that's grown quite substantially is the number of commercial or even packaged fertilizers that you can actually find on the market. So I tend to break them down into your dry or your liquid. So there, you know, a lot of these are kind of the byproducts of our meat production industry. So things like blood meal and bone meal, fish meals, you know, after we've, you know, raised our animals and taken the meat off of them, there's obviously a lot of waste out of that. So, you know, the bones get ground up into a fine powder, they get treated and heat treated, and there's a whole process that it goes to, but it basically then gets converted into a fertilizer. There are also some plant-based ones, soybean meal and cottonseed meal, alfalfa meal as well, rock phosphate, you know, it's mined. And then bat and bird guanos as well are also quite common. Most of those are available in a dry form, so it's either going to be a granular or some type of powder, and they tend to be, you need to mix them into the soil. They're typically applied pre-planting, and these tend to be more slow release. So again, they're that, you know, organic nitrogen form that really needs to be mineralized before that nitrogen can be taken up by the plants. There's also a lot of liquid fertilizers that are now, and this part's growing as well, the liquid organic fertilizers. These tend to be quicker release than the dry forms, and so you can actually use these throughout the season. As you know, you can kind of just apply them to the root system itself through a drip line, or even, you know, if you're a home gardener, just, you know, through an old watering can. But things like fish emulsions, kelp extracts, and there's a lot of different fermented materials out there as well. At the Organic Strawberry Trail I was doing at NREC, we were using something that was like a fermented corn type product. It smelled like molasses, it was sticky, thick, like molasses as well. But it was in fact an organic fertilizer, and we applied it through our irrigation system to the crop. But this is an industry that's really grown. You know, you can find a lot of different organic fertilizers, even at your home garden stores in this day and age. Again, with a lot of these fertilizers, what you're getting in terms of NP and K can vary. But if you're really looking for a nitrogen fertilizer, using a blood meal or a feather meal, some type of fish meal or powder, cottonseed meal, and your seabird and bat guanos, those are really, they're going to have the highest concentration of nitrogen in them. If you're looking for something that's really high in phosphorus, then, obviously rock phosphate is the best thing you can apply. But a lot of these seabird and bat guanos also have a lot of phosphorus in them, as well as do the fish meals and bone meals. And then for potassium, there aren't a lot of things that are really high in potassium. There are some kelps. There's also something called green sand that's also sold as organic fertilizer that's also quite high in potassium as well. But in terms of knowing how much to apply, the best thing to do is to test your soil. So, you don't have to test it every year, but certainly testing it every 3 years is recommended. There's a lot of different laboratories that will do soil tests in Oregon. OSU has a publication on that if you're looking for laboratories. And some of them, you can get a complete soil test for as little as $15. That will tell you, your macronutrients, your percent organic matter, your pH, probably some micronutrients, that can kind of give you a complete analysis of what your soil has. And I definitely recommend that. Testing pH is particularly important. I know here in Western Oregon, a lot of the soils tend to be acidic. And if the soil is too acidic, then some of those nutrients, it kind of impacts the biological activity in the soil, and then some nutrients become insoluble at low or high levels. So making sure your pH is within the right range, somewhere around that 6.5 range, is actually quite important for nutrient uptake by plants. So it is important to test your soil, particularly the pH of your soil, but it also helps to test the nutrient status of your soil so that I was gardening, we had a student garden at Chemeketa, and the first year I got there, I tested it, and the phosphorus levels were exceptionally high. They're in the excessive levels. So that was kind of a sign to us that we didn't need to be applying any fertilizers that had phosphorus in them. And even the second year when we tested, again, really high. Third year, you started to see the phosphorus go down a little bit by that third year, but even then, it was still at a really high level. So you don't want to be applying fertilizers just for the sake of applying them. Things like nitrates and phosphates, they can leach into our groundwater. They cause algal bloom and other types of pollutions in our streams. So don't just apply fertilizer for the sake of applying them. Know how much your crop needs, know what your soil has, and then base it on those two factors. So that kind of covers organic fertilizers. Now I want to talk about what organic pest management means and what's allowed and what's not allowed in organic. So we'll just go back to kind of what the rule states here. And basically, first you have to try preventive practices. So before you reach for a chemical pesticide, even one that's allowed, you have to first try to prevent pest outbreaks from occurring and use best management practices or even integrated pest management practices such as cultural, biological, or physical methods. If all those things fail, then you can use some type of allowed material. And just a reminder, synthetic considered prohibited unless specifically listed as allowed, non-synthetic considered allowed unless specifically listed as prohibited. Just a reminder that organic pest control, to be effective, you have to know what it is you're trying to control. And this is where the Master Gardener plant clinics are really important. They can help people identify what type of pest is eating their plant and then give you the best practices for controlling that particular pest. Don't go out and just spray chemicals for the sake of spraying chemicals. Not every insecticide will control every insect. Not every fungicide will control every fungal pathogen. So you really have to know what it is that you're trying to control. You have to understand the life cycle of that pest a little bit as well, when the best time to spray is. So all of that is really important, and I encourage folks to seek out their local Master Gardener plant clinic if they have questions about that. They're really great about helping people identify these things. But in terms of what types of practices, they get broken down into cultural, biological, physical, chemical, and lately in some IPM papers and manuals, I've even been seeing this category of genetic as well. So I'll just kind of quickly explain what some of these are. Those of you who have studied IPM before, this will kind of be a refresher for you, but cultural practices can be anything from sanitation. So, you know, cleaning your tools and implements to make sure you aren't spreading pathogens around. Crop rotation is really important. That again is one of kind of the main practices of organics, is rotating crops. So not growing the same crop in the same place year after year after year, actually rotating them around the field. You know, certain pests like certain crops. And so if you're growing, say, tomatoes in the same place year after year, you're basically kind of building up the population of certain pests in the soil during that time. So you kind of want to rotate into a crop that maybe isn't a host of that pest to break that pest life cycle up. So crop rotations are really important. Things like plant spacing, you know, to make sure that plants aren't competing with each other for light and nutrients and water. Also, it helps reduce humidity and temperature between plants, which can help reduce, you know, fungal outbreaks and things like that. Not overwatering or underwatering your plants, that's very important. I think a lot of the problems we see in the plant clinic, a lot of people assume they're you know, biotic issues, but oftentimes you find that people just aren't watering. You know, why is your lawn brown? Well, you didn't water enough is probably the answer a lot of the time. So make sure your water management is on point. Removing alternative pests, building soil health, all of those are considered cultural practices for pest control. There's a lot of biological practices as well. And this is another area that's kind of grown substantially. You know, maybe 20 years ago or 30 years ago, gardeners could maybe buy some ladybugs and, you know, praying mantis at the local garden store. And now there's a whole slew of different biological and beneficial type, you know, agents that are essentially available for people. So, you know, there's your beneficial animals and insects, so things like ladybugs and predatory mites. Beneficial nematodes as well. Some of them are biological or microbial products, things like BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, or even the Bavaria bassiana as well. And then also things like attractant or repellent crops. All of these tend to fall into that biological control category. This is a list of, you know, and I'll give you this publication at the end. It's EM067E. It's a free publication on the OSU Extension website. But if you want to learn more about biological or control agents or natural enemies, it's a great publication and kind of gives you a list of the typical ones you'll find here in the Pacific Northwest. And then also what they tend to control. So for example, you can use lacewings for controlling everything from mites and aphids to white flies to mealybugs, and even scale type insects as well. So much like it's important to know what you're trying to control, it's also important to know what you know, natural enemies are in and around your garden and being able to identify them. You don't want to assume that something's a pest. It could very well be a ladybug larva or something that's crawling around on your plant that's not actually eating your plant, it's actually eating the aphids. So it's once again important to be able to kind of help identify those things before you go out and spray a pesticide. There's a lot of different physical or mechanical control practices that can also be used for pest management. Here in the picture, you obviously see a flame weeder. Be careful with those. You know, have a hose close by. Don't do it during the dry season. And also, you know, just be aware it's only burning the top of the plant. The root system's still intact. Most likely will grow back, and you really have to use that when the weeds are really young. Barriers, using different types of barriers for excluding pests. So down at the bottom, you can see some agricultural fabric that's kind of over these hoops, and that's there really to help exclude flea beetles from getting into the young seedlings of the pest. There aren't a lot of great organic pesticides. There aren't organic pesticides that really control flea beetles. So excluding them and kind of keeping them out when plants are in those young, vulnerable seedling stages is one of the best practices that organic farmers can use for that. Things like using mulch, you can see straw mulch for suppressing weeds, traps, you know, even things like pruning out infected plant parts. All of these are essentially considered physical control options. And then I'll also point out rototilling or cultivation as well. That's particularly important for weed control, there aren't a lot of great organic herbicides that are available out there. So if you're organic gardening or farming, you typically have to resort to other types of practices. And then there's this category that, as I mentioned, I'm starting to see popping up in IPM papers that refers to these genetic controls. Obviously, genetic modified organisms would be part of that. And just to make it clear, GMOs are prohibited for use in organic agriculture under the National Organic Program Standard. So they are not permitted, but you can use, as long as they weren't produced through certain practices. There are a lot of resistant or tolerant varieties that were developed through traditional breeding practices that are actually allowed. And that's one of the most important things you can do. If you're, there's a lot of people down here in Eugene that want to plant peach trees. I generally try to talk them out of it, but, a lot of people want to grow them anyway. So my main piece of advice is make sure you get one that's resistant to peach leaf curl, because otherwise you'll be battling that every single year. So selecting varieties that are resistant to, or tolerant to certain, pests is also really important. There's potatoes that are resistant to scab and tomatoes that are resistant to fusarium. So, if you're growing potatoes every year and you have scab issues, consider selecting a scab resistant variety the next year that you plant your garden. And then, of course, there's chemical control. So when all those other practices have failed and you still have a pest issue, then at that point, you can resort to chemical control. There's obviously all sorts of different types of pesticides. I understand you'll be doing a pesticide talk coming up, so I won't spend too much time on that. But just a reminder, non-synthetic considered allowed, synthetic considered prohibited. But in terms of organic pesticides, they can kind of be broken down into different categories. There's botanical pesticides, so those that come obviously from plants. Certain microbial or microbial derived pesticides, sometimes those are referred to as biologicals. There's certain oils that can be used. There's minerals and certain elements. And then of course there's some inorganic or synthetic agents that can also be used if they're specifically listed as allowed or restricted under the National Organic Program. So just real quick, some botanical pesticides. I'm sure many of you have seen neem. You've probably used neem oil in and around your garden. That's one of the most common botanicals that are used. It comes from a tree that's native to India. It's Azadirachta indica. And it's been used for a long time, particularly in India, as a natural pesticide. It's really got well known worldwide. There's a German scientist, I think he was down in the Sudan, and there was like this locust outbreak. And every tree was essentially defoliated except for these Azadirachta indica trees that were still there with all their leaves on them. And so he took some leaves and took them back to a lab and studied them and realized that there were insecticidal properties within that tree. Pyrethrins are also quite common. So those come from the chrysanthemum flower. And then in this day and age, you also might see things like limonene, which is a citrus extract. It can be used for controlling things like mealybugs. And corn gluten is starting to be used as kind of a pre-emergent herbicide as well. I personally haven't used it, but I know others who have that have said that it does in fact work well. In terms of microbials or biologicals, there's a lot of different types. Many of you have probably heard of BT or Bacillus thuringiensis. It's commonly used against Lepidoptera type pests, especially those in the larval stage, but it's actually a naturally occurring soil-borne bacteria. Spinosad is also very common. It's produced by soil bacteria. Even Bavaria bassiana, it's a naturally occurring fungus. So all of these microbials are now, produced, manufactured, put into bottles and sold, on shelves in gardening stores in this day and age. So you can go down to a local gardening store and look at the active ingredients on the product and potentially see one of these microbial agents listed there. Obviously, a lot of hort oils can be used as well. There's lots of different types of oils. There's botanical oils that can be used for pest control. And then there's also a lot of kind of these refined petroleum-based oils as well that are sometimes referred to as like narrow range or mineral oils as well. A lot of these, they're really used to control these soft-bodied insects. So they act as suffocants and kind of clog the spiracles on the insects and prevent them from breathing, and so it kills them. You do want to be careful with oils in terms of the time of year you use them. Your dormant oils should only be applied during the dormant season, so during those winter months. For example, you want to be careful not to apply them, you know, a lot of the narrow range oils, you don't want to apply them when it's really hot out as well. So always read a label before using a product to make sure you're following the directions, and you don't want to go out and burn your crop. And then of course there's a lot of different minerals or elements. Sulfur is commonly used against powdery mildew, for example. Kaolin clay kind of acts as a barrier. So you can actually see that bottom picture with, I think those are pears if I remember correctly. And that one tree that's white, that's essentially been sprayed with a kaolin clay product. So it basically confuses the insects so they can't actually find where to land. Coppers are often used, fixed coppers in particular. They're often used as fungicides against a whole slew of different pathogens. And then there's also things like potassium bicarbonate. And of course, diatomaceous earth, which I imagine a lot of you have maybe used in and around your home to control ants or other types of things. A few others, insecticidal soaps. Some of you may even make your own homemade soap sprays, but you can also buy insecticidal soaps. Things like acetic acid are sometimes used as vinegar. Be careful with those. Herbicidal vinegar is actually, it can be blinding. I don't know that people always use that. They go out and just spray it. It could be a windy day. If it gets in your eyes, it can actually cause permanent eye damage. So again, always be careful. Don't assume just because something's organic or approved for organic doesn't mean that it's non-toxic. You always want to read the label, follow the directions, and make sure you're wearing your personal protective equipment as well. Okay, so yeah, just a reminder, we're starting to get down on time, so I'll try to wrap it up here fairly quickly, but you know, always read a label. There's a lot of important information that goes on there, you know, and again, you know, you can find the active ingredients, you can find what the product was derived from, and here, once again, you see that OMRI label. So the OMRI is, again, the Organic Material Review Institute. So, you know, any chemical manufacturer who wants to sell a product to organic farmers, how do organic farmers know that that product's allowed? How do they know what's actually in it? They don't. And those manufacturers aren't going to disclose all that information to every farmer throughout America. So what they can do is actually apply, you know, send their product into the Organic Material Review Institute. OMRI will review that product, they'll review what goes into it, how it was manufactured, how it was made, and they will determine whether or not that product meets the regulations of the National Organic Program Standard and would be allowed for use in organics. So anytime you see that OMRI label on a product, it means that it's gone through the OMRI review process and is allowed for organics. You can also go to the OMRI website and look products up. They're an Oregon-based institution. They're in Eugene. They've been around for at least 30 years now, probably longer, and they're pretty well known as well. Washington State Department of Agriculture also puts out an organic input material list as well. So you can often see that WSDA registered material for organic farming label or logo on a label as well. And you may even see the CDFA, that's the California Department of Food and Agriculture. They also have their own internal review process. So sometimes you will see that CDFA organic input material logo on a label, but basically what those logos mean is that they have been reviewed and deemed approved. So just again, with organic pesticides, you know, always monitor your garden, know what it is you're trying to control, know its life cycle. Research preventative practices and use cultural, physical, and biological options first, but when all else fails, when using pesticides, always read the label. The label is the law. Research, you know, that pesticide, know how it works, what it's going to control, how often you have to apply it, and always follow the label rates as well in terms of how much you should be applying. This is just another reminder that just because something's organic doesn't mean it's completely safe. A lot of these organic materials can be, you know, they have certain toxicities to humans, but also some of our pollinators as well. So there is a great OSU publication that it's actually OSU, University of Idaho, and Washington State. It's on how to reduce bee poisoning from pesticides. And they actually give you a list of different active ingredients. And they use this traffic light system of green, yellow, and red to kind of determine whether or not it's, you know, non-toxic, low toxic, or high toxic to bees. So you can see something like pyrethrin, it is, you know, it's a non-synthetic, it comes from the chrysanthemum flower, it's a botanical pesticide, but it is in fact actually quite toxic to bees. So if you're using pyrethrins, you know, you want to make sure you aren't applying them to flowering crops that bees and other pollinators may be visiting. You know, and also it's good at practice to apply things in the evening so that they have time to dry overnight before the bees come out back out in the morning and are active once again. So again, don't make assumptions that, again, organic does not always necessarily mean safe. So a lot of people want to know, why isn't everyone organic? Right now, I think about 2% of the acreage farmed in North America is certified organic. So the other 98% are not. And really what that comes down to is, one, organic farmers don't have as many tools available to them as, say, conventional farmers. So there's not an organic solution to every pest, you know, every insect or pathogen out there, or certainly not to weeds as well. So there's a lot of challenges involved with organic farming. There's a lot of risk involved in terms of if you do have a pest outbreak, you don't have the tools to control that pest. And then also there's just hasn't been as much research into organics as there has been into conventional. You know, as I noted, some of those first chemicals came out of World War II back in the 40s, but organic farming research for the past 50 years has been quite minimal. It's gotten better since the USDA National Organic Program, because now there's federal funds that get allocated for organic research. With the growth of the organic industry, there's now universities throughout the US that offer degree programs or certificate programs in organics, and even people that focus on organic research as well. But they're a bit behind the ball compared to conventional agriculture. So, you know, there's a lot more research that needs to be done into organic in order to develop more tools for farmers to be able to farm organically with less risk associated with it. I just want to point out this one Washington State study. They, 2016, kind of a meta-analysis. They looked at 40 years of science that compared organic and conventional agriculture. They looked at not just productivity, which is often the thing that's used. You know, obviously that's a very important one, is getting yield. A lot of farmers, that's really what they care about at the end of the day, because that's their profit right there. But they also looked at things like environmental impact, economic viability, and also social well-being as well. And what they found was that with exception of maybe yield and nutritional quality of crop, in most other metrics, organic actually fared better across the board. So it's better for the environment due to the biodiversity that's often involved in organic systems, as well as the fact that you get a price premium for organic, that it tends to often be more economically viable. And oftentimes, not always, but sometimes organic farmers are maybe a little more tuned into some of the social issues surrounding labor and other practices in farming. So that's just one study. There's others that show that, yeah, organics increase biodiversity. You know, the yield thing is a big thing. There are some crops that can get comparable yields with organic production. There's others where you see a huge decline in yields in organic production as well. So it really varies from crop to crop. And then I just want to point out a couple publications before I wrap up. These, again, are all available on the OSU Extension catalog, so you can download them for free. And I put the codes here, so you can just type those into the search thing. But a couple on beneficial insects. You know, there's this pocket guide, as well as the other one, beneficial insect spiders and other many creatures in your garden. So those are really tailored for the Pacific Northwest. And again, it's important to be able to identify both the good bugs and the bad bugs, because you don't want to be out there spraying, you know, your ladybugs and killing your ladybug population off if you don't need to be. So another one is soil fertility and organic systems, so a guide for gardeners and small acreage farmers. And then finally, fertilizing with manure and other organic amendments. So that's a link. I'm just seeing my sources question. So I'll leave this link up here, but it's a link to the OSU Extension catalog. I also recommend the Pacific Northwest Pest Management Handbooks, UC California IPM webpage if you want to get to OMRI. And then there's also ATTRA, that's the Appropriate Technology Transfer for Rural Areas. So they're federally funded, and they put out a lot of great publications and information on organics as well. And with that, I'll stop and go ahead and open it up for questions.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you so much, Erica. It looks like we are running a little bit low on time, but we'll try to answer 1 or 2 questions and then we'll close it up. So there was one quick question about what was the name of the pathogen that affects brassicas? Do you have that specific name?
Clubroot.
Say that again?
Clubroot.
Clubroot.
Yeah.
Okay, Clubroot. Perfect. And then we had several questions asking about if you have names or addresses of laboratories for soil testing in this area, and if there are soil tests that aren't too expensive for like a small garden.
Yeah.
It just posted a publication, but if you have other...
I would just recommend the OSU publication on laboratories that service Oregon. You can find a whole list of them in there. You can go to their website and typically find their prices and fees. And as I noted, some of them, you know, you can get a complete soil test for as little as $10 to $15. So definitely check out the websites and kind of find one that will work for you.
Perfect. And then another kind of common question, one from Sarah, is I have a compost container and I don't eat only organic fruits and veggies. Does my compost still qualify as organic for her little vegetable garden?
Yeah, that's not something that's regulated in the compost regulations in terms of what goes into. The compost regulations are really about the heat that you get the temperature pile to, how often you're turning it, etc. So yeah, you know, as long as you follow those temperature and turning regulations, then it would essentially be considered organic compost.
Perfect. We have a couple more specific questions that we will get back to those individuals after the webinar. One final question from an anonymous attendee. Are there any initial first steps to organic gardening that you would recommend to somebody that's new to organic gardening?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the same things I would recommend to anyone that's starting a garden. Select your site very carefully, you know, make sure it has good sun. Well-drained soils are important as well. And if you have a heavy clay soil, do raised beds and then build up, you know, that organic matter. Start with the cover crop maybe, and then turn that into the soil or apply some compost, but really start feeding the soil, I think would be my advice. So feeding it through, you know, adding some type of carbon substance to it, whether it be compost or some types of manures, or like I said, cover crops would be my first tip for getting started with organics. Healthy soil, you'll have a healthier crop. So that's really important.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you to Erica and for everyone for joining us on this Gardening to Save the World webinar. And thank you for presenting about organic gardening tonight. Our next webinar will be on drought-tolerant plants on June 3rd, and you can pre-register online if you'd like to attend. I hope you have a good rest of your evening, and we will get back to you if you submitted any additional questions. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Okay.